What happened to Sylvester Stallone at 79? The heartbreaking truth will leave you in tears. A man who punched his way out of poverty, turned down $360,000 in cash when he was almost broke, survived a heart that started swelling inside his chest on a movie set, buried his own son, and then learned to walk with a cane. That man is Sylvester Stallone at 79. And the most shocking part is not what Hollywood did to him. It is what life did to him when the cameras stopped rolling. Stay with this, because by the end, the way you see this man will never be the same again. The boy nobody wanted. Most people think Sylvester Stallone's story started the moment Rocky hit theater screens and the whole world stood up and cheered. But the real story started way before that. It started in a hospital room on July 6th, 1946, in a neighborhood called Hell's Kitchen in New York City. And it started with pain. The delivery was difficult. The doctors had to use metal forceps to pull him out into the world. Those forceps grabbed the wrong nerve. A facial nerve on the left side of his face was permanently damaged the moment he was born. His lower lip drooped. One side of his face did not move the way it should. And his voice, that thick, slow, heavy voice that would one day be recognized by hundreds of millions of people around the globe, was a direct result of that birth injury. He did not choose that voice. It was forced on him before he even took his first breath. Now think about what that means for a little boy growing up in New York City in the 1950s. Kids are not kind to differences. They notice everything. They copy everything. A little boy with a drooping lip and a voice that sounds like he is pushing every word through mud is going to get noticed, and not in a good way. Young Sylvester felt every single one of those stares. He heard every quiet laugh. He knew when a classroom went a little too silent after he spoke. That kind of loneliness does not make a loud sound. It just follows you everywhere, from the school bus to the lunch table to the playground. It is like a shadow that never leaves, even on cloudy days. But the birth injury was only the beginning of it. His home life was not a soft landing from the hard world outside. His parents had a difficult marriage. The family moved a lot. There were stretches of time when young Sylvester was placed in foster care and boarding homes. He was shuffled between places, between families, between versions of himself that were never quite allowed to settle. When a child grows up never knowing where they truly belong, something changes inside them. A quiet hunger forms, not for food, but for permanence. For someone to look at them and say, "You matter, you belong here, we are not going anywhere." Nobody said that to him for a long time. So he built his own world. He retreated into his imagination. He found dark movie theaters where he could sit in the cheap seats and watch men on the screen command rooms, inspire crowds, and move through the world like they had the right to take up space. Those flashing black and white images on the projector screen were not just entertainment to him. They were a blueprint, a picture of what a man could become if he just refused to stay down. He also started lifting. Not in a fancy gym with coaches and nutrition plans and recovery rooms. He lifted whatever heavy objects he could find in cramped basements and small back rooms. There was something honest about the weight. It did not care who his parents were. It did not laugh at his voice. It just pushed back. And when he pushed harder, it moved. For a boy who felt like the whole world was pushing him out, finding something he could move with his own hands was everything. By the time he reached his teenage years, he had already carried more emotional weight than most people carry in a lifetime. He was behind in school. He had trouble fitting in. He was the kid who got noticed for all the wrong reasons. But something inside him had already started forming, something quiet and stubborn and deeply resistant to the idea of giving up. He was learning, without anyone teaching him, that the only way through pain was to keep moving forward, even if nobody was watching and nobody was clapping. That lesson would be the one thing he carried out of childhood and into the brutal world that was waiting for him. Part 2. The years. Nobody talks about here is the part of the Stallone story that most people skip over because it does not fit the clean, inspiring arc of the Rocky legend. Before the triumph, there were years. Long, cold, humiliating years that would have broken most people completely. When Stallone arrived in Hollywood in the early 1970s, he was not welcomed. He was barely tolerated. The city already had its leading men. They were smooth and polished and classically handsome. Stallone had a face that was not quite symmetrical, a voice that sounded like gravel wrapped in velvet, and a walk that looked like he was always bracing for a punch. Casting directors did not know what to do with him, so they mostly ignored him. He took whatever he could get: small parts in forgettable films, background roles where he was just a face in the crowd. He was desperate enough to take a part in an adult film early on, something he later spoke about with a mix of embarrassment and raw honesty, saying he did it because he was so broke, he was afraid he might end up on the street. This was not a man living the Hollywood dream. This was a man surviving 1 week at a time, holding on to the idea that his life had a purpose that he had not found yet. He lived in a small, freezing apartment. He could barely pay the rent. At one point, he had to make one of the hardest decisions of his life. He sold his dog, his best friend, to a stranger outside a liquor store for $50 because he could not afford to feed the dog or himself. He stood there on that sidewalk and watched his dog walk away with a stranger, and he felt something break open inside him. He promised himself that if he ever made any money, the first thing he would do was buy that dog back. He held on to that promise. He also held on to the idea that had been forming in his mind since he was a child watching movies in cheap theater seats. He believed that if the industry would not give him a role worth playing, he would write one himself. So, in 3.5 days, working in a furious creative sprint that was equal parts inspiration and desperation, he wrote the script for Rocky. The story he wrote was not complicated. It was about a small-time club fighter from Philadelphia who everybody wrote off as a joke. A man who was not the best or the fastest or the most talented, but who simply refused to accept that his story was already over. A man who got one shot at something bigger than himself and decided that even if he could not win, he was going to go the distance. Sound familiar? When producers read the script, they loved it. They wanted to make the movie right away. But then they looked at the man who wrote it and said, "We want a real star for this." They mentioned names like Robert Redford and James Caan, proven box office draws, who would guarantee the studio a return on their investment. And they started offering Stallone money to walk away from the project. The first offer was around $20,000. He said no. They came back with more. The offers reportedly climbed higher and higher, with some accounts placing the final number at $360,000. That is not just a lot of money in the 1970s. That is life-changing, problem-solving, never sleep on a cold floor again money. That is the kind of money that lets you breathe. For a man who had sold his dog to buy groceries, that offer was not just financial. It was almost cruel in how tempting it was. He said no. He told the studios he was not selling the script unless he was the one standing in front of the camera. He was not just protecting his art. He was protecting himself. He understood, maybe without even having the words for it, that if he sold Rocky and watched someone else play the role, he would be selling the most honest version of himself for cash. And no amount of cash could buy back what he would lose in that moment. The studios eventually gave in. They gave him a modest budget, a tight schedule, and a camera crew. And Stallone walked onto that set in Philadelphia and did something remarkable. He did not act the role of Rocky Balboa. He bled into it. Those cold streets, that cramped apartment, that battered gym with its peeling walls and its smell of sweat and leather, none of it required much imagination from him. He had lived versions of all of it. Every moment of exhaustion on that screen was real exhaustion. Every look of quiet determination was not performed. It was remembered. Rocky came out in 1976, and the world went completely silent for a moment, and then it erupted. The film was nominated for 10 Academy Awards. It won 3, including Best Picture. The unknown man with the crooked face and the impossible voice had just beaten every traditional leading man in Hollywood at their own game. And when he went back to that liquor store, he bought his dog back. He reportedly paid $1,500 for a dog he had sold for $50. He did not care. He had made a promise to himself, and he kept it. But here is where the story gets complicated in a way nobody really talks about. Part 3. What fame actually cost him. Fame arrived fast, and it arrived loud, and it brought with it everything that a man who grew up invisible could have dreamed of. By the time the 1980s rolled in, Stallone was not just a movie star. He was an event. Rocky, Rocky II, Rocky III, Rocky IV, First Blood, Rambo, First Blood, Part 2. Each one bigger than the last. He was the box office. He was the poster on every bedroom wall. He was the man that millions of people watched when they needed to remember that standing back up was still possible. But to be that symbol for the world, he had to offer his body up as a kind of sacrifice. During the preparation for Rocky III, Stallone pushed himself to a level of physical conditioning that went well past what any sports doctor would call reasonable. He later claimed he dropped his body fat down to around 2.8%. That is not a fitness goal. That is the edge of a medical emergency. The human body needs fat to protect its organs, regulate hormones, and keep the brain functioning. At 2.8%, there is almost nothing left but muscle and bone. He was surviving on tiny amounts of food, mostly protein and black coffee, running and training for hours each day while his body screamed at him to stop. The audiences saw a man who looked like he had been sculpted out of granite. What they did not see was the man behind that image who was quietly exhausted, quietly hurting, and quietly convincing himself that the pain was worth it because the film had to be real. Because real was the only thing he knew how to be. And then came Rocky IV. In that film, Stallone wanted the fight scenes to feel authentic. He asked his co-star Dolph Lundgren, a man who is 6 feet 5 inches tall and built like a structure, to hit him with real force during filming. Lundgren obliged. One punch landed directly on Stallone's chest with full power. On screen, it looked like exactly what he wanted. Off-screen, the consequences were terrifying. Stallone's heart started to swell inside his chest. His blood pressure shot up to 260 over something, which is the kind of number that puts emergency room doctors into high gear. He was rushed off the Canadian film set and flown to a hospital in California, where he spent 4 days in intensive care surrounded by machines and doctors. He had pushed his body so far in the name of authenticity that he had nearly died for a movie scene. He did not slow down after that. He kept going, film after film, stunt after stunt. He insisted on doing his own physical work because he believed the audience could feel the difference between a man truly in the fight and a man pretending. That belief was probably correct, and it was slowly destroying him from the inside out. The Expendables films, made when he was already well into his 60s, pushed him further than a man his age should have been pushed. During a fight scene with Steve Austin, he sustained a serious injury to his neck. A metal plate was eventually inserted into his spine. He emerged from that production, by his own admission, fundamentally different in his body than he had been going in. But here is the part that fame never prepared him for and that no training session could ever fix. In the summer of 2012, Sage Stallone died. He was 36 years old. He was Sylvester's eldest son, born from his first marriage. The coroner ruled the cause of death as coronary artery disease, a natural cause, but one that does nothing to make the loss easier for a parent who has to sit in a room and understand that their child is gone. Sage had followed his father into acting. He had a role in Rocky V. He and his father had a relationship that, like many parent-child relationships lived inside the pressure cooker of fame, had its complicated chapters. But he was his son. He was his firstborn, and he was gone at 36, which is an age that no parent should ever have to bury. Stallone made a brief public statement. Then he went quiet. He did not turn his grief into a press tour. He did not write about it in interviews or use it to generate sympathy. He carried it privately, the way a man carries the heaviest things, not because he is strong enough to bear them easily, but because there is simply no other choice. You wake up the next morning and you keep moving, not because the pain has gone anywhere, but because life keeps going, whether or not you are ready to go with it. Watching him in the years after that loss, continuing to work, continuing to show up, continuing to carry himself with a kind of quiet dignity, might be the most honest picture of who this man actually is, underneath everything the world built around him. He did not save the day. He could not. And that is the most human thing about him. Part 4. The marriage, the break, and what love actually looks like. Jennifer Flavin has known Sylvester Stallone since 1988. They dated for years, split once in a notably dramatic fashion, reportedly via a 6-page letter he sent to end things while he was briefly involved with someone else, and then eventually found their way back to each other. They married in 1997 and had 3 daughters together, Sophia, Sistine, and Scarlett. For over 2 decades, she was the one who saw what the world did not get to see. Not the action hero, not the icon, just the man. A man who came home from a film set smelling like fake blood and real sweat, whose knees were stiff every morning, whose back was a daily negotiation with pain. A man who had spent so many years playing characters who could not afford to show weakness that he sometimes forgot to take off that mask when he walked through the front door. A man who carried enormous public love and sometimes did not know how to translate that into the quiet, everyday kind of presence that a family actually needs. Fame creates a specific kind of distance inside a home. When your face is on billboards and your name is spoken on television and strangers stop their cars to point at you on the street, it becomes very hard to also be the person who asks what is for dinner and remembers to take out the trash and sits still long enough to really listen. The gap between the image and the person is not always intentional. It builds slowly, one distraction at a time, until one day you look across the table and realize you have not truly been present in a very long time. In August of 2022, Jennifer filed for divorce. She cited irreconcilable differences. After 25 years of marriage, the foundation had cracked under the weight of all that life. This was not a tabloid surprise created for entertainment. This was 2 real people who had built a real life together and were standing at a point where they were no longer sure the life they had built was still working. The split was brief. A few months after the filing, they reconciled. There was no big dramatic announcement, no press conference, no carefully crafted social media moment. They simply chose each other again. And sometimes that quiet, undramatic decision to try again is the bravest thing 2 people can do. Because it means looking honestly at everything that broke and deciding the relationship is still worth the work of putting it back together. What that reconciliation required from Stallone was probably harder than any fight scene he ever filmed. It required him to admit that being a legend in public does not automatically make you a good partner in private. It required him to understand that applause fills a room, but it cannot fill the silence that forms between 2 people who have stopped truly hearing each other. It required him to learn, at an age when most men feel like they have already figured out who they are, that the work of being a good husband and a good father is never finished. He has spoken in recent years about his relationship with his daughters, with a warmth that feels different from the controlled public persona he carried through his peak years. He speaks about them with humor and with genuine affection. He looks like a man who finally understands that the real achievement of his life is not a box office number. It is the people who will remember him not as Rocky or Rambo, but simply as Dad. There is something quietly extraordinary about a man who spent 40 years being celebrated for his toughness, deciding in his final chapters to be soft, to be present, to put down the armor and just be a person sitting in a room with the people he loves. That is not a small thing. For a man wired the way he is, with every instinct trained toward performance and strength and never showing the wound, choosing vulnerability is probably the hardest thing he has ever done. And he is doing it, day by day, imperfectly, but genuinely. Part 5. Sylvester Stallone at 79, the man behind the legend. Here is the truth about Sylvester Stallone right now, in 2025, at 79 years old. He moves differently. Anyone who has seen him at recent public appearances knows this. The walk that once looked like a man heading into battle now has a careful quality to it. The body is working harder to do things it used to do without thinking. In 2025, reports noted that he needed a cane after a back procedure. The man who once went into intensive care after filming a boxing scene was now navigating the world with a cane. A cane. Think about what that means for a man whose entire identity was built on the image of physical invincibility, the posters, the movies, the culture. For decades, Sylvester Stallone was what people pointed to when they wanted to show what a human body could do if it just refused to accept its limits. And now that body, the one that absorbed real punches and survived real injuries and pushed through conditions that would have sent most people straight to the hospital, is asking for help to walk. The spinal fusions, the metal plate in his neck from the Expendables injury, the years of accumulated damage from doing things the hard way because he believed in giving the audience something real, the back procedure in 2025 that left him needing support. All of it is the physical story of a man who paid his professional debts in flesh. But here is the thing that nobody really says out loud. He does not seem broken by it. He has spoken about his physical limitations with a kind of honesty that is rare for someone who spent so long projecting invincibility. He does not pretend the pain is not there. He does not perform health for the cameras. He shows up as he is, slower, stiffer, more careful, and he keeps working. He starred in Tulsa King for Paramount Plus, playing a New York mobster sent to Oklahoma to build a criminal operation at an age when most action stars have long since retired to the golf course. He executive produced the Rocky-adjacent spin-off Creed and has been deeply involved in trying to reclaim some creative control over the franchise he literally built from nothing. He has spoken publicly about his frustration with not having had full ownership of the Rocky character, about watching others profit enormously from a story that came entirely from his own life, his own hunger, and his own refusal to give up. That fight for his legacy, the legal and creative battle to claim ownership of what he created, is maybe the most Rocky thing about him, even now, even at 79. He is still looking at the thing in front of him and refusing to walk away without going the distance. And then there is the personal legacy. 3 daughters who are building their own lives and careers. A wife who chose him again when she could have chosen differently. A family that knows the real man, not the poster version, and shows up for him anyway. He has 4 grandchildren now, and if you watch the way he talks about them, with a kind of softness that the 1980s version of himself would never have shown on camera, you see something remarkable. You see a man who finally feels like he is exactly where he belongs. He has been open about his spiritual life in recent years, about how his faith has become a more central part of how he processes everything he has been through. The losses, the physical decline, the career shifts, the complicated chapters with his family. He has found a framework for all of it that does not require him to be invincible, that allows him to be human and still feel like his life has meaning and direction. He still wakes up early. He still values discipline and structure, but the goal of that discipline has changed completely. He is no longer trying to build a body that looks like it was carved out of stone. He is trying to take care of the body he has left, the one that has done more than he ever had the right to ask of it, and keep it functional for as long as possible. He paints now. He has talked about how much he loves art, how it gives him a way to express things that even decades of acting never quite captured. He creates things not because anyone is paying him to, or because a studio needs a product delivered on a deadline, but because making something is its own reward when you finally have the time to understand that. There is a man in his mid-70s who has homes most people will never walk into, who has financial security beyond what most people can picture, and who is sitting in the quiet of his life using that security not to perform wealth or maintain his public image, but to just be, to spend time with his wife and daughters, to paint, to write, to wake up in the morning and not have to perform Sylvester Stallone for the next 16 hours. He has earned that, at a price that most people will never fully understand. Think about the full span of it. A child born with nerve damage on his face, who grew up being told in 100 small ways that he did not quite fit anywhere. A young man who slept in cheap apartments and sold his dog and still believed so completely in his own story that he turned down enough money to change his life because he refused to let someone else tell it. A man who gave his body to his craft in ways that left permanent marks inside his bones. A father who outlived his firstborn son and had to learn how to carry that and keep going. A husband who had to learn, the hard way and more than once, that being loved requires you to be present in a way that fame never taught him. And now, at 79, a man who walks with a cane and paints in his free time and shows up for his family and talks about his grandchildren with something that looks an awful lot like peace. That is not the ending of a legend. That is the full picture of a human life. The thing about Rocky Balboa that made the whole world stand up in that theater in 1976 was not that he won. He did not win, at least not in the first film. He lost the decision, but he went the distance. He stood there at the end of 15 rounds, bloody and swollen and barely standing, and he had proven something to himself that no championship belt could have given him. He proved that he could take everything that was thrown at him and still be standing at the final bell. Sylvester Stallone is still standing at 79, slower, marked by everything that has hit him, changed in ways that are permanent, but still here, still creating, still showing up for the people who need him, still fighting, not for fame or applause or box office records, but for the quiet, hard-won, deeply personal victory of being okay with who he is and what he has been through. And honestly, that might be the most powerful performance of his entire career. If this story hit you the way it hit me, go ahead and leave a like. It is a small thing, but it matters. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you do not miss what is coming next. And I genuinely want to know what you think. After everything he has been through, everything he has lost and survived and rebuilt, what part of Stallone's story hits you the hardest? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one.